I didn't ask him to leave it there, not yet. The moment I saw Jason Miller's car sitting in my driveway like it belonged there, I just stood on the front steps and let the silence do the talking. It was a late afternoon in suburban Chicago, the kind of calm neighborhood where you can hear lawn sprinklers ticking and distant dogs barking like nothing in the world ever really goes wrong. My name is Ethan Carter, and I used to believe boundaries didn't need defending when people respected each other. Jason used to be one of those people. Back when life was simpler, he wasn't just a friend, he was the guy I trusted with everything I hadn't even said out loud yet. We built things together, talked about futures that felt like they were going to last forever, and back then I would have sworn there wasn't a version of him that would ever make me stop mid-step in my own driveway just to question what I was seeing. But people change in ways you don't always notice right away. That car wasn't just parked badly, it was positioned like a statement, like it had a right to be there, like I was the one who needed to adjust to it. I remember the exact moment I noticed it, hands still holding the grocery bag, keys halfway between my pocket and the lock, just frozen as if my body was waiting for my mind to catch up. A neighbor across the street slowed down their walking pace, glanced over, then looked away too quickly like they didn't want to get involved in something they already sensed didn't belong to them. I didn't call out. I didn't move it. I didn't even shake my head. I just let it sit there, occupying space it hadn't been given. Because the truth is, there are moments when reacting too fast only gives away how much control you don't have yet. And Jason, whether he realized it or not, had just stepped into one of those moments. I walked inside my house slowly, placed the grocery bag on the counter, and glanced through the window again. The car was still there. Still unmoved. Still wrong. And instead of frustration, what I felt was something quieter, something more deliberate. Because I wasn't looking at an accident. I was looking at intent. And intent always tells you more than action ever does. Jason didn't just end up in my driveway by mistake. People don't drift that far into someone else's life without a reason. The question was never why he parked there. The question was why he thought he could. And I already knew, even before I said a word, that the answer to that question wasn't going to stay simple for long. So I did what probably didn't make sense to anyone watching from the outside. I left it there. Not because I didn't see it. Not because I didn't care. But because sometimes the first move in a much bigger game is choosing not to move at all. I stood in the kitchen longer than I needed to, not because I was confused about what I saw outside, but because I was trying to understand when something so simple started to feel so deliberate. The house was quiet in that way suburban homes get in the middle of the afternoon, refrigerator humming, air vents shifting soft air through empty rooms, everything pretending like it had always been this way. Jason Miller did not always show up like a problem. There was a time when his presence felt as natural as Sunday mornings and coffee that cooled too fast while we talked about nothing and everything at the same time. We met in college, two guys who thought effort was enough to guarantee direction in life. And for a long stretch of years he was the kind of friend who never needed an invitation. He would just appear at the door, knock once, and walk in like the world had already signed off on it. Back then, I never questioned it. That is the part one kept replaying now, standing in my own kitchen while looking out at my driveway like it belonged to a different version of my life. Somewhere along the way, Jason stopped knocking. It did not happen all at once. It started small, like borrowing things without asking, then staying a little longer than expected, then showing up during moments that were no longer shared spaces. I remember the first time Olivia mentioned it, not as a complaint, just as an observation, saying that Jason had a way of acting like every space eventually adjusted itself around him. I laughed at the time, like it was harmless confidence, the kind of personality trait you do not overthink. But confidence can quietly turn into assumption when nobody draws a line. That was the pattern I could only see clearly now in hindsight. The driveway, the car, the way he positioned it so casually as if he had done it 100 times before without resistance, it all felt like the final step in a process I had ignored while it was happening. I walked past the counter, picked up a glass of water, and stood by the window again. The car had not moved. A delivery truck passed slowly on the street, the driver glancing toward my house for a fraction of a second before continuing on. Even strangers notice when something feels slightly off, even if they cannot explain why. Jason and I had not spoken much in the past year. Life had a way of spacing things out: work schedules, family obligations, the quiet drift that nobody admits is happening until it is already complete. But he had started reappearing recently in small, almost invisible ways: a text here, a short visit there, comments on things I never asked him to comment on. It was not aggression, not confrontation, just presence expanding into spaces it was not invited into. I remember thinking once that familiarity was supposed to feel safe, but there is a point where familiarity stops being comfort and starts becoming assumption. And standing there in my kitchen, watching his car sit in my driveway like a misplaced decision, I realized I had crossed that point without noticing. I did not feel urgency. I did not feel anger. What I felt was recognition. Because somewhere deep down, I already understood that this was not about a parking spot. It never was. I stayed at the kitchen window longer than I expected, holding the glass of water without really drinking from it, watching the sunlight shift slightly across Jason Miller's car as if even the day itself was unsure about it. The quiet inside the house did not feel empty, it felt paused, like something had already started somewhere else and I had not been informed yet. That feeling pulled me backward without warning, into a version of time I usually avoided thinking about. Jason and I were not always like this. There was a stretch of years where his name and mine were spoken in the same breath so often that people around us stopped separating us at all. College, early jobs, shared apartments that smelled like instant coffee and ambition, those years built a kind of illusion that friendship like ours was permanent by default. I remember nights where we sat on the floor eating takeout, talking about future plans like they were guaranteed outcomes rather than guesses. Back then, Jason had a way of turning every idea into something that felt already halfway real. That was part of what made him easy to trust. He never hesitated when life asked for confidence. But confidence, I learned later, can sometimes blur the line between what is earned and what is assumed. The first real shift did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, in the form of small inconsistencies that I chose not to name at the time. Missed calls that were never returned, decisions made without conversation, explanations that sounded complete but felt slightly unfinished. I told myself people get busy, lives expand, and not every silence means distance. But looking back now, standing in my kitchen watching his car sit where it should not be, I could see the pattern forming long before I was willing to admit it existed. Olivia noticed it first, in the way she notices most things that matter. One evening she mentioned, almost casually, that Jason had started acting like our plans were secondary to his convenience. I remember laughing it off, saying that was just his personality, that he had always been a little too comfortable in any space he entered. But she did not laugh. She just looked at me for a moment longer than usual, and went back to what she was doing. That moment returned to me now with uncomfortable clarity. I walked away from the window and set the glass down on the counter, the sound of it touching marble feeling louder than it should have. My phone sat nearby, silent, screen dark, offering no explanation, no interruption, no relief. I realized then that what bothered me most was not the presence of the car itself, but the absence of explanation around it, as if the situation had already been decided somewhere I was not invited into. Jason had not asked? He had not explained. He had simply arrived. And in doing so, he had revealed something that was harder to ignore than the act itself. This was not random. It was not careless. It was familiar. And familiarity, when it starts ignoring boundaries, is never as harmless as it first appears. I did not move from the kitchen right away, not because I was unsure of what I should do, but because I was trying to understand what kind of confidence makes a person believe they can take up space in someone else's life without asking. Jason Miller's car still sat in my driveway, unchanged, like time itself had accepted it even if I had not. The longer I watched it, the more it stopped feeling like an object and started feeling like a message I had not agreed to receive. I set the glass down and finally stepped away from the window, letting the curtain fall back into place, as if hiding it could somehow return the world to its normal shape. But nothing about the house felt normal anymore. Even the quiet had changed texture, less like peace and more like anticipation. I checked my phone again without thinking, then immediately set it back down when I saw nothing there. No message. No explanation. No simple clarification that could make the situation smaller. That absence of communication told me more than anything Jason had done so far. Olivia came into the kitchen a few minutes later, keys in her hand, pausing when she noticed my expression. She followed my gaze without asking, looked through the window, and saw the car. She did not react immediately. She just stood there for a moment, as if measuring how real it was before deciding what to say. Finally, she asked if I had spoken to him recently. I told her no, not in any meaningful way, and even as I said it, I realized how strange that sounded given what was sitting outside. She exhaled slowly and set her keys down on the counter, not angry, not surprised, just observant in a way that made the situation feel even more structured than I wanted it to be. She mentioned that Jason had called her a few weeks earlier, something casual, asking about schedules and plans, nothing urgent, but she said there was a tone in it that felt slightly off, like he was checking how flexible things had become without directly asking. I had dismissed that detail at the time when she first brought it up, but now it returned with sharper edges. I walked past her and toward the hallway, not because I intended to go outside yet, but because I needed distance from the window. The house felt smaller than it had this morning, like the walls were slowly adjusting themselves around an unspoken decision. I remember thinking that friendship is supposed to have invisible boundaries, lines that do not need to be enforced because mutual understanding holds them in place. But Jason had always treated familiarity as permission rather than agreement. That was the difference I had ignored for too long. From the hallway, I could still see part of the driveway through the side window. The car had not moved. A passing vehicle slowed slightly on the street outside, then continued on without stopping. But I noticed a brief glance from the driver, the same kind of glance people give when they sense a situation they do not fully understand. That small detail made something settle in me. Not urgency, not anger, but clarity. Because it became obvious that this was no longer about waiting for Jason to explain himself. It was about recognizing that he already had a version of reality in his mind where his actions made sense without needing my approval. And that realization shifted everything, not outwardly, not yet, but internally, in a way that made me stop thinking about what he had done and start thinking about what I was still willing to allow. I stood in the hallway longer than I intended, not because I was waiting for something to happen, but because I could feel that something already had. The house behind me felt different now, as if every room had quietly adjusted itself to the presence outside without asking for my permission. Jason Miller's car was still in the driveway, unchanged, but my attention was no longer only on the car itself. It was on what it represented, the idea that someone could occupy your space without acknowledging the boundary they were crossing. I tried to trace back when that pattern first started, when Jason stopped behaving like a guest in my life and started acting like he belonged in every part of it. There was a time when he would wait for an invitation, when he would ask before making decisions that affected more than just himself. That version of him felt distant now, almost like a story I told myself to explain why I trusted him so easily in the first place. Olivia was still in the kitchen, moving quietly, her presence steady in a way that contrasted with the tension building in my thoughts. I could hear the faint sound of a cabinet closing, the soft rhythm of someone trying to maintain normalcy even when normalcy no longer fit the situation. I did not tell her what I was thinking. Not yet. Because part of me wanted to see how far this would go without interference, to understand whether Jason intended this as a message or simply as habit. A few minutes passed, and then I noticed movement outside. Jason was no longer just sitting in the car. He had stepped out, slowly, like someone who already believed he had permission to be there. He stood beside the vehicle for a moment, looking toward the house, not rushing, not hesitant either, just comfortable in a way that did not match the situation. I stayed where I was, partially hidden by the hallway wall, watching without making myself visible. He adjusted his jacket, glanced around the neighborhood, and then began walking toward the front path. There was no urgency in his steps, no sign that he thought anything about this was unusual. That detail stayed with me more than anything else. People reveal their assumptions through movement more than words, and Jason's movement suggested he believed this was already settled. I remember thinking how strange it was that silence could feel like both protection and preparation at the same time. From inside the house, everything looked controlled, but outside, the situation was slowly redefining itself. Olivia entered the hallway behind me at that moment, following my line of sight. She did not ask what I was going to do. She simply looked, then waited. Jason reached the front steps and paused there, as if deciding whether he needed to announce himself or continue as if he was expected. That pause lasted only a second or two, but it carried more weight than anything he had done so far. I realized then that this was no longer about a car or a driveway. It was about expectation, about what people believe they are allowed to take for granted when no one stops them early enough. And standing there, watching him approach my door as if the conversation had already been agreed upon, I understood that the next moment would not be about reaction. It would be about definition. I watched Jason Miller stand at the front door like it was a place he had entered before without thinking about it. His hand hovered near the doorbell, not pressing yet, as if he was giving himself a moment to confirm that nothing about this situation could challenge him. From where I stood in the hallway, partially hidden from view, I could see the faint reflection of his face in the glass pane beside the door. He looked calm, almost rehearsed in his confidence, the kind of calm that does not come from understanding a situation but from assuming it will adjust itself in your favor. Olivia was beside me now, silent, her presence steady but alert. Neither of us spoke, and that silence between us felt heavier than anything Jason had done so far. Finally, he pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed through the house in a way that felt sharper than it should have, like it did not belong inside this space anymore. I did not move immediately. I let the sound finish traveling through the house before taking a step forward. When I reached the door, I paused just long enough to understand my own breathing, then opened it. Jason was standing there with the same expression he had worn outside, relaxed, almost casual, as if he was arriving slightly early to something already planned. He smiled when he saw me, a small upward curve that suggested familiarity rather than uncertainty. He glanced past me briefly, taking in the interior of the house, then looked back as if nothing about the situation required explanation. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence between us was not uncomfortable for him in the way it was for me. It was familiar, like he expected it to eventually resolve itself. Then he finally spoke, asking how things were, his tone light, almost careless, as if he had simply stopped by during a normal afternoon. I noticed his eyes flick once toward the driveway behind him, as if checking that the car was still there, still accepted by the space it occupied. I stepped slightly to the side, not inviting him in, not blocking him either, just leaving the threshold undefined. Olivia appeared behind me then, standing a few feet back, watching without interrupting. Jason acknowledged her with a brief nod, still calm, still comfortable. He mentioned the car first, casually, saying he had not planned on staying long, that something had come up and the driveway was just the easiest place to leave it for a bit. The way he said it suggested that it was not a request for permission but an explanation after the fact. He then added, almost as an afterthought, that he figured I would not mind, since it was not really in anyone's way. That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else. Not because it was aggressive, but because it revealed the structure of his thinking. He was not asking if it was acceptable. He was confirming that I would adjust. I did not respond immediately. I looked at him for a moment, letting the words settle, understanding that this was not about a car or convenience. It was about expectation. And in that moment, I realized Jason had not come here to ask anything at all. He had come here already believing the answer. I stood there for a moment after Jason Miller finished speaking, letting his words settle into the space between us without giving him the reaction he seemed to expect. He was still relaxed, still positioned like nothing about this interaction required adjustment on his part. That was what stood out the most. Not what he said, but the absence of uncertainty in how he said it. Behind me, I could feel Olivia's presence steady and quiet, not interfering but fully aware of every shift in tone and posture. The house felt like it had narrowed into the entryway, as if everything beyond it no longer mattered for the moment. Jason glanced again toward the driveway, then back at me, as if confirming that the situation remained exactly as he had left it. I finally spoke, not raising my voice, not adding weight to my words, just acknowledging what he had already assumed. I told him the driveway was not something to use without asking. My tone was calm, but deliberate enough that it broke the rhythm he was operating in. For the first time since he arrived, I noticed a subtle change in his expression, not discomfort exactly, but recalibration, like he was adjusting his internal expectation of how this conversation would proceed. He gave a small laugh, brief and dismissive, as if trying to keep the interaction light, and said something about not realizing it would be an issue. The words were casual, but they did not match the precision of his arrival or the confidence with which he had explained the situation earlier. That contradiction stayed with me. People do not usually underestimate boundaries by accident, especially not ones they once respected. Olivia stepped slightly closer then, not interrupting, but close enough that her presence added weight to the silence that followed. Jason shifted his stance for the first time, a subtle movement of discomfort that lasted only a second before he corrected it. He looked at both of us, then back toward the street, as if measuring whether this moment required escalation or withdrawal. I could see the calculation happening in real time behind his eyes. This was no longer a casual visit. It was becoming a moment where assumptions were being tested against reality. He mentioned again, more slowly this time, that the car would only be there temporarily, that he had a few things to handle nearby and would move it soon. But even as he spoke, the certainty in his voice had softened slightly, as if the environment was no longer confirming his expectations. I did not respond immediately. I let the silence return, not to provoke, but to allow space for clarity to form without interference. Jason was no longer standing the same way he had when he first arrived. The ease in his posture was still there, but it was no longer complete. Something in the structure of the moment had shifted, and he was beginning to recognize that what he assumed to be already decided might not be decided at all. I could feel the moment stretching out in a way that no one in the entryway was willing to interrupt. Jason Miller was still standing just outside the threshold, but the confidence he carried when he first arrived had begun to lose its clean edges. It was still there, but now it felt like something he was actively maintaining instead of something natural. He shifted his weight slightly, glancing once more toward the driveway, then back at me, as if trying to find the version of this conversation where everything stayed simple. Olivia remained just behind me, silent, her presence steady like an anchor that did not need to announce itself. I finally stepped slightly forward, not closing the door, not widening the space, just controlling the rhythm of it. I told Jason again, calmly, that nothing on my property was something to be assumed, not even temporarily. I did not raise my voice, and I did not add emotion, but the words carried further than before because they were no longer just clarification. They were definition. Jason nodded slowly, the kind of nod that tries to acknowledge something without fully accepting its weight. He ran a hand briefly through his hair, then exhaled like the situation was becoming mildly inconvenient rather than meaningful. He said he understood, but the way he said it did not align with how little he had understood from the beginning. There was a difference between hearing words and recognizing boundaries, and I could see he was still operating somewhere between the two. Behind him, the driveway remained visible through the glass panels of the door, his car still positioned exactly where he had left it. That detail no longer felt passive. It felt like a silent extension of the conversation itself, something that continued speaking even when no one was. Olivia finally stepped forward slightly and asked him directly, in a calm tone, whether he had planned to move it today. The question was simple, but it changed the air instantly. Jason hesitated for a fraction longer than before, then said he would take care of it soon, as if the timing of it was still entirely within his control. That was the first time I noticed something more precise in his expression, not discomfort, but a subtle recalculation of certainty. He was no longer just explaining, he was adjusting. I watched him closely now, not because I was expecting escalation, but because I was beginning to see the structure beneath his assumptions. People do not usually realize when their version of reality stops matching the space they are standing in. Jason was still trying to keep his tone light, but the consistency of that tone was starting to break against the lack of agreement around him. I did not need to argue further. The point had already shifted. This was no longer about whether he could leave the car. It was about whether he understood that leaving it had never been his decision to make in the first place. And for the first time since he arrived, I saw a pause in him that did not look like confidence or casual control. It looked like recognition that something he had been leaning on was no longer holding. I could feel the shift in the air before anyone moved. It was not dramatic, not loud, not something that would be obvious to anyone watching from the outside, but in the narrow space between the doorway and the hallway, everything had changed in a way that could not be reversed. Jason Miller was still standing there, but he was no longer occupying the space with the same ease he had carried when he first arrived. His posture had tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in awareness, like he had begun to understand that the rules he assumed were not automatically in effect here. I did not step back, and I did not step forward either. I simply remained where I was, allowing the silence to hold its shape without rushing to fill it. Olivia stood just behind me, still and observant, not intervening, but fully present in a way that added weight to every second that passed. Jason glanced toward the driveway again, then back at me, and for the first time his expression did not immediately return to neutral confidence. There was a pause that lingered longer than before, not uncertainty exactly, but something closer to recalibration, like he was revisiting the assumptions he had carried into this moment, and realizing they were not being confirmed. He finally spoke again, his tone softer than earlier, saying he did not intend for anything to feel out of place. The words were careful, measured, and for the first time they sounded like they were being chosen rather than defaulted. I listened without interruption, not because I was accepting the explanation, but because I was understanding its limits. There was a difference between intent and impact, and in this moment, only one of them mattered. The driveway was still visible behind him, the car still occupying the space he had treated as temporary and harmless. That detail now felt less like a mistake and more like a reflection of how far assumption can travel when it is not checked. Olivia finally spoke again, her voice calm but direct, asking him once more when exactly he planned to move the vehicle. This time the question did not feel like clarification. It felt like a boundary being restated after it had already been crossed. Jason hesitated before answering, and in that hesitation, something subtle shifted. He said he would handle it soon, but the certainty that had carried his earlier responses was no longer intact. It sounded less like a plan and more like a concession. I noticed the change immediately, not because of what he said, but because of what was no longer present in how he said it. The ease was gone. The assumption of agreement was gone. What remained was awareness that the situation was no longer aligning with his expectation of it. I did not need to escalate anything. I did not need to reinforce anything further. The structure of the moment had already done that on its own. Jason exhaled slowly, glanced once more toward the street, and then back at the house, as if measuring whether continuing this conversation served him in any meaningful way. And in that brief pause, I understood something clearly. This was no longer about a driveway, or a visit, or convenience. It was about the realization that access is not the same as permission, and familiarity is not the same as ownership. And for the first time since he arrived, Jason did not look like someone who was certain he belonged where he was standing. I remember the exact moment the conversation stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started feeling like a structure revealing itself in real time. Jason Miller was still standing in my doorway, but something about him had shifted from confident presence to measured awareness, like he was no longer just participating in the moment but studying it. The silence between all three of us was no longer passive. It had become functional, like it was holding weight that no one was willing to drop. Olivia had not moved from her position behind me, but I could sense her attention sharpening, not emotional, not reactive, just observant in a way that made every detail feel more defined. Jason looked between the two of us again, and for the first time since he arrived, his eyes did not settle on a single assumption of how this was supposed to end. He spoke again, carefully, saying that he did not mean to create tension, that he had only planned a short stop and did not expect it to become complicated. But even as he said it, the phrasing revealed something deeper. He was still framing the situation around his intention rather than its impact, as if intention still carried authority over outcome. I let that thought sit without correction. Instead of responding immediately, I shifted slightly in the doorway, not closing it, not opening it further, just changing the angle of control in a way that made the space feel less automatic for him. Jason glanced once more toward the driveway, and I could see the calculation returning, but now it was different. It was no longer confidence adjusting to inconvenience. It was awareness adjusting to resistance. He exhaled slowly, then said he would move the car as soon as possible, his tone now more careful than casual. The certainty he had carried earlier was no longer present in his voice. It had been replaced by something quieter, something that acknowledged he was no longer speaking into a space that automatically agreed with him. Olivia finally spoke again, not raising her voice, not challenging him, simply confirming what had already been established. She asked if he understood that assumptions about access to property were not interchangeable with permission. The question was calm, but it restructured the moment completely. Jason did not respond immediately. He looked at her, then at me, and for the first time since he arrived, there was no attempt to maintain ease. The pause that followed was not defensive. It was reflective. And in that reflection, I could see the shift happening in real time. He was no longer interpreting the situation as something that would resolve itself through familiarity. He was beginning to register that familiarity no longer carried authority here. The driveway, the car, the visit, all of it was no longer being treated as neutral actions. They were now being evaluated under terms he had not set. He finally nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition that the frame had changed. And in that moment, I understood that the conversation had already moved past explanation. It had moved into consequence. I could feel the moment settle into a different kind of silence, not the kind that waits for someone to speak, but the kind that confirms something has already been decided without needing more words. Jason Miller was still at the threshold, but he no longer carried the same effortless certainty that had defined him when he first arrived. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, but I could see it clearly now. His posture had shifted slightly. His shoulders no longer completely relaxed, his attention no longer anchored to a single assumption about how this interaction would unfold. He was still composed, still controlled, but now it felt like control that required awareness rather than instinct. Olivia remained beside me, steady and observant, her presence reinforcing the structure of the moment without needing to speak. Jason glanced briefly toward the driveway again, as if checking whether the situation outside the house still aligned with the version he had brought with him. It did not. That realization seemed to register in small increments rather than all at once. He cleared his throat softly and said again that he would take care of the situation, this time with more emphasis on timing than certainty. The words were no longer casual. They were careful, as if each one had to be weighed before being released. I noticed that change immediately. It was not just what he said, but what he no longer assumed would be accepted without question. I did not interrupt him. I simply let the silence hold after his statement, allowing it to define the space instead of filling it. Jason shifted his weight again, then nodded once more, slower this time, as if acknowledging not agreement, but adjustment. Behind him, the driveway remained visible through the glass, the car still occupying the exact position it had been in since earlier. That detail no longer felt like background. It felt like a reference point for everything being said inside. Olivia finally spoke again, her voice calm but precise, asking him if he understood that continuing to treat access as default rather than permission was not something that could be assumed here. There was no anger in her tone, only clarity, and that clarity seemed to land more heavily than anything else so far. Jason did not respond immediately. For the first time, he looked fully present in the moment rather than operating slightly ahead of it. His gaze moved between both of us, then briefly toward the street beyond the driveway, as if orienting himself to a situation that no longer matched the expectations he had carried into it. The pause that followed was longer than any before it, and in that pause, something fundamental shifted. He was no longer trying to maintain ease. He was trying to understand structure. And structure, once recognized, cannot be ignored without consequence. He finally exhaled and gave a small, restrained nod, not dismissive, not defensive, but acknowledging that the frame of the situation had changed in a way that could not be reversed by familiarity or intention alone. I watched him carefully now, not because I expected escalation, but because I could see recognition forming in real time. This was no longer about explaining what had happened. It was about realizing that what had already happened could no longer be interpreted through the same assumptions that brought him here. I noticed the shift before anyone moved. Jason Miller was still standing at the doorway, but the energy he carried into the house had changed again. It was no longer the confident ease of someone who assumed acceptance, nor the recalibrated caution from moments before. Now it was something quieter, more controlled, like he was consciously holding himself together rather than relying on instinct. Olivia remained beside me, steady and unreadable, her attention fixed on him without any need for words. The silence in the entryway had become structured, almost procedural, as if every pause was now carrying meaning that could not be ignored. Jason looked between us again, then toward the driveway beyond the glass, and I could see that he was no longer just observing the situation. He was measuring it. Not in terms of convenience, but in terms of outcome. He finally spoke again, his tone noticeably more restrained than before, saying that he would resolve the parking situation immediately, and ensure there would be no further misunderstanding. The phrasing mattered. It was no longer casual language about temporary inconvenience. It was acknowledgement that the situation required correction. I did not respond right away. I let his words sit in the space between us, not reinforcing them, not challenging them, simply allowing them to exist without validation. Jason shifted slightly, then gave a brief nod, this time without attempting to soften it. There was no smile now, no attempt at familiarity layered over the moment. Just recognition that the interaction had moved into a different category entirely. Olivia stepped forward slightly, not closing distance aggressively, but enough to reinforce presence, and said calmly that understanding boundaries was not optional depending on circumstance. Her voice remained even, but the clarity of it removed any ambiguity from the room. Jason listened without interruption. For the first time since arriving, he did not attempt to respond immediately. Instead, he looked down briefly, then toward the driveway again, as if the car outside had become less of a convenience and more of a liability he had not fully calculated. That pause was different from the others. It was not resistance. It was processing. I could see the internal adjustment happening in real time, the slow recognition that the framework he had been operating under was no longer supported by the environment he was standing in. He finally exhaled and said nothing further, only giving a small, controlled nod that confirmed he understood the instruction rather than the assumption behind it. I noticed then that he was no longer trying to maintain control of the conversation. He was trying to exit it cleanly. The change was subtle, but complete. The presence he had carried into the house had been replaced with awareness of limitation, and that awareness had shifted everything without a single raised voice or visible confrontation. The driveway, the car, the visit, all of it now existed under a different interpretation than the one he had arrived with. And in that final moment of silence, I understood that what had just happened was not resolution through agreement, but resolution through recognition of boundaries that could no longer be ignored. I remained standing in the doorway after Jason Miller stopped speaking, not because there was anything left to decide in that moment, but because I could feel the weight of everything settling into place without needing further action. The air in the entryway had changed again, not tense now, not uncertain, but structured, as if every assumption that had brought him here had been quietly reorganized by the simple act of being challenged without escalation. Jason stood for a moment longer, his attention no longer moving freely between confidence and familiarity, but anchored instead in a quieter awareness of limits he had not previously accounted for. He finally gave a small, controlled nod, then glanced once more toward the driveway through the glass. There was no attempt to reframe the situation anymore, no subtle insistence, no casual reinterpretation of what had already been said. Instead, there was only acknowledgement, measured and restrained, that the space he had entered was not operating under the assumptions he brought with him. He spoke briefly, saying he would move the car immediately, his tone now stripped of casual ease and replaced with something closer to resolution. The words were simple, but the shift behind them was not. It was the first time since he arrived that his actions aligned fully with understanding rather than expectation. Olivia remained beside me, still and observant, her presence no longer reinforcing tension but confirming completion. She did not add anything further, and she did not need to. The structure of the moment had already concluded its internal correction. Jason stepped back from the threshold slowly, not rushed, not defensive, but deliberate, as if recalibrating his orientation to the space around him. I did not follow him with my attention immediately. Instead, I stayed where I was, allowing the silence to hold its final form without interruption. Through the glass, I watched him walk back toward the driveway, the same path he had taken earlier, but now with a different weight to each step. The car remained where it had been, unchanged, but the meaning attached to it was no longer what it had been when he first arrived. He reached it, paused briefly, and then got in. There was no ceremony to the movement, no visible frustration, only completion of something that had already been decided before he physically acted on it. The engine started, and within moments the car pulled away from the driveway, turning out onto the street with the same familiarity it had arrived with, but carrying none of the assumption it had once represented. I watched it disappear down the road until it was no longer visible, and even after it was gone, I remained still for a moment longer, not processing conflict, but recognizing closure. Olivia finally exhaled softly beside me, not in relief, but in acknowledgement of finality. No more words were exchanged between us. There was no need for them. The house returned slowly to its natural quiet, not the kind that waits for something to happen, but the kind that exists when nothing further is required. I realized then that what had taken place was never about confrontation or control. It had been about recognition, about the moment when assumption meets boundary, and is no longer able to continue unchanged. And as I stood there in the stillness of my own home, I understood that nothing about the situation had needed to be forced. It had simply needed to be seen clearly enough to resolve itself.